Welcome back to the Stronger by Science podcast. I'm Greg.
And I'm Lyndsey.
And we have another great show for you today. But first, Lyndsey, do you have any media recommendations, shout-outs, or happy thoughts to get the good vibes rolling on this episode?
Sure. I think the main thing we want to talk about is Fat Bear Week.
Yes.
Because the people have been clamoring to hear our takes about that. I will, just before we get into that though, I'm not going to call it a recommendation. We are watching Love is Blind. I don't know if you should watch it as well, but we're watching it. If somebody else is already watching it, I'd be interested to see what they think, but I won't necessarily tell you to start watching it because this season is a fucking mess.
Yeah, it's been a beautiful dumpster fire so far. I if anything would recommend this season more than other ones, because if you like reality TV for the mess, this is definitely a very messy season.
I guess that's true. I feel like there's just been more relationship mess in prior seasons, and this year it's just kind of like general mess.
Yeah.
And there's a lot fewer couples to focus on this year because everyone hates each other.
Yeah, I am interested to see how the producers are going to manage it instead of, because fewer couples made it to the proposal and are still rolling. So they're going to have to allocate their time differently. They might have to throw in some like different twists to kind of just fill the airtime. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to either be really fun or perhaps really boring in the last bunch of episodes that's going to drop next week. But thus far, I found it very enjoyable.
Yeah, I'm enjoying watching it, but it's like there's not really a couple to root for this season.
I don't know about that.
Okay, fair enough. Maybe you're not as cynical as I am.
I mean, I like Izzy and Stacy. I think they're cute. I definitely think they're going to have some issues to work out related to them coming from different class backgrounds. Yeah. But we'll see.
Yeah. Anyways, let's move on to what people actually care about.
Fat Bear Week.
Yes.
As you're listening to this, we are in the midst of Fat Bear Week. Let's see. Yeah, this will be dropping on Wednesday. I believe voting for Fat Bear Week is theoretically supposed to start tomorrow as we're recording this, October 3rd. Mm-hmm. And a champion will be crowned on October 10th. But currently, I think some stuff is still up in the air. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, whenever I was looking at the website earlier, it did say that they were going to have the bios and announce the bears in the running tonight.
Okay.
So Monday, October 2nd at 7 p.m. Eastern time is what I saw. So that has not occurred as per this recording yet, but it will have occurred. So we'll see. We'll see if there are some of our faves from the last years back up, or if we have some fresh meat in there. I did look at the junior cub that recently was crowned.
Yes.
And he is stupendous. A good bear.
Yes. Spring Cub 806. Very good. He got very fat and we're so happy for him. Just as some background, mm-hmm. if this is your first year listening to the Stronger by Science podcast, this has become a bit of a yearly tradition around these parts. The Katmai National Park in Alaska has a competition every year called Fat Bear Week that, I'm honestly not sure what purpose it serves. Maybe just to bring attention to the park, maybe sell some merch, whatever. Yeah. But it also brings awareness to a very important issue in the ursine community, which is that bears have to get very fat because they hibernate, mm-hmm. and they need plenty of fuel in their body to get them through the winter. And so every year they run this little competition. It's a bracket. Anyone can vote, where you basically just vote on which bear you think got the fattest, or just which bear's bulking journey you enjoy the most.
Right.
and they crown a winner. And so yeah, that's going to go on. It almost got either canceled or postponed due to the government shutdown that I think is going to be averted.
I believe so.
But yeah, like it's a national park, so it's federally funded. All of the employees' salaries, and including the people who would be doing all of the Fat Bear stuff on the website, comes from federal money. So if the government would have been shut down, those people would have been furloughed. And the competition would have been postponed or canceled this year. But yeah, that isn't going to happen. But I do think they're a little bit behind as a result, because all of that was up in the air for a while. So yeah, Lynds, just from like history or memory, do you have any bears that you're pulling for this year, even though they haven't announced all of the contestants?
Well, 747 won last year, right?
Yes.
And I was looking back at his before and after from last year, and honestly, incredible work by him.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to seeing an update. But I would love to see some new bears in the mix.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Grazer, as we've talked about in previous iterations of Fat Bear Week content. But I also think if you're a betting person, it's hard to pick against 480 Otis.
Yeah,
like
another reigning champ.
Yeah, he's won 4 times, and I won't pretend like I'm a year-round Fat Bear fan. Like there are cameras in the park that you can just like watch a live stream of. That's not me. Like, I'm not that dedicated to the cause.
Now, I did find a YouTube channel that curates the best from those live cams.
Ooh.
Because I wanted to check out 806 Spring Cub and see a bit more of his journey. And there's people out here doing the Lord's work of watching the bear cam and clipping and giving you like 4-minute videos on YouTube if you are interested in that.
Honestly, send that to me.
I will.
Also, can you post that in the show notes?
I will. Yeah.
Hell yeah. But yeah, what I was gonna say is like, I feel like 480 Otis for a casual Fat Bear fan like me.
Yeah.
It's kind of like being an NBA fan in the 90s, where it's just like, yeah, you don't follow the off season, you don't know what moves were made, but like going into the year, it's like, I assume the Bulls will be good again. That's how I feel about Otis.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll see. It should be another exciting week and another great Fat Bear season.
Yes, very exciting.
Okay, so we are about to get into the plugs and start the episode, but before we get rolling, I just want to make one quick note, and that is that next episode, we're aiming for it to be a crowd pleaser. So this is the third part of our micronutrient series, and we realize that is not the topic that everyone is the most interested in. I think it's cool. I think it's been some good content.
Yeah.
But like the listener numbers are down. Like, I can take that on the chin. Honestly, I kind of expected it. So next episode, we want it to be stuff that you are very interested in and very invested in. So we are going with an all Q&A episode. So the episode will be as interesting to you as your desire to submit a question that you want an answer to. So ask good questions and it'll be a good episode. If you have a question that you'd like us to address on the podcast, could be about anything, record a voice memo, 30 to 60 seconds, and email it to podcast@strongerbyscience.com. And if we like your question, we'll answer it on the next episode. So yeah, I think that's it for housekeeping notes. Let's get into our plugs.
Yeah. So if you're enjoying the show, please like, rate, subscribe, and tell your friends. It really helps us out and helps people find the podcast. If you're interested in hiring a virtual coach to help you with your training and or your nutrition, Stronger by Science has a team of excellent coaches that can help you. You can learn more at strongerbyscience.com/coaching. If you want to purchase supplements from a reliable source and support the podcast at the same time, check out bulksupplements.com. You can use the code SBSPOD to get a 5% discount. And other than supporting our team of coaches, the main product Greg and I focus on these days is MacroFactor, our premium macro tracking and diet coaching app. We both use it and love it. It recently celebrated its second birthday. It's been out in the world for over 2 years now.
Which is 14 in dog years.
Okay. I don't know how that translates to app years. I don't know if it's
no
more
idea.
or less. Okay. Thank you for that input, though.
No problem.
But if you would like to try MacroFactor, you could do it for free for 14 days by using the code SBS during sign up. It's available on the App Store and Google Play. Or if you want to learn more about the app before you sign up for that free trial, check out our website, macrofactorapp.com.
Absolutely. And if you would like to stay up to date on exciting new research coming out, there are 2 things you could do. You could check out our newsletter, which you can find at strongerbyscience.com/newsletter. We send research breakdowns every 2 weeks on podcast off weeks. It's not just a bunch of promotions. We won't spam you. It's like almost everything you get if you sign up for the newsletter is just going to be the type of content that you're interested in. We're assuming since you listen to this podcast. And if you would like to take that a step further, you could subscribe to the Mass Research Review. That stands for Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. Great group of folks run it. They go through all of the studies published for anyone who's interested in getting stronger, getting more jacked, getting leaner, whatever. If you want to keep up to date with the research, Mass, I think, is the best way to do it. And if you would like to get a little bit more into the Stronger by Science content universe, you should join our Facebook group and subreddit. The Facebook group is Stronger by Science Community. The subreddit is just r/Stronger by Science. That is the best place to go, but either of those places is the best place to go if you'd like to stay abreast of all of the things going on, especially related to the podcast. Mm-hmm. So we are, for instance, going to be answering your micronutrient related questions at the end of this episode. And the way that you would have known that we were going to do that and to submit questions on that particular topic would have been to join the Facebook group and subreddit. That's where we put out the call. So yeah, those are good places. You should check them out. And then finally, just kind of, I already mentioned this, but just standard plug here at the end. If you have questions for the podcast, record a 30 to 60 second voice memo. Don't exceed 60 seconds. We will not listen to it. 30 to 60 seconds, though, that's the sweet spot.
Under 30 seconds would also be fine.
Yeah, but like no one actually does that.
No one's concise.
Yeah.
They're a Stronger by Science fan.
I can't judge anyone for that.
I know.
But yeah. Record a voice clip and email them to podcast@strongerbyscience.com. All right, let's get into it.
Yeah, like you mentioned, today we are wrapping up the 3-episode micronutrient series. So the first episode we published covered micronutrients themselves, what they are in their history. The second episode discussed nutrient targets, where those targets come from and what they mean. In this episode, we want to get a little bit more practical and discuss which micronutrients are most worth monitoring if you want to do that, and why you shouldn't allow a focus on micronutrients specifically to detract from the pursuit of a generally healthy diet.
Absolutely. And just so you know, all of the things I'm about to mention will be linked in the show notes. But there is a 5-part article series on micronutrients on the MacroFactor website. The kind of landing page for all of those articles will be linked in the show notes. And this article, or this episode in particular, mostly covers content from the last 2 articles in that series, which will also be linked in the show notes. And lastly, if you would like to read more about each particular micronutrient, we have just a page of content on each of those micronutrients in the MacroFactor knowledge base, and kind of the landing page for that will be linked in the show notes as well. So if you want to know kind of how easy or difficult it is to track a particular nutrient, the general likelihood that you might be consuming too much or too little of that nutrient, good dietary sources of nutrients, etc. Those are the sorts of things on each of those micronutrient pages. And kind of the home page for all of those will also be linked in the show notes.
That's such an excellent resource that you put together.
Thank you.
And it's not just for Macrofactor users. Obviously, the Stronger by Science audience could get a lot out of that as well.
I hope so.
So, today we're going to talk about micronutrients that are most worth monitoring. So I think to set us up for answering that question, Greg, will you tell us what the difference is between an insufficient intake and a deficient intake? I feel like this is something that probably is going to seem obvious once people learn it, but it's not always in the conversation when you hear about micronutrients.
Yes, I think I touched on this in the last episode, but just to make this more explicit at the start of this episode and to kind of frame everything we're about to talk about next, I think terminology matters in this discussion, and very frequently when people talk about consuming like a little bit less of a particular nutrient than the RDA or the EAR or the AI or whatever, there's a tendency for folks to use the term deficiency, like you're not consuming quite enough, therefore you're deficient in this nutrient. But that is not the best term to use most of the time. Generally, insufficient or inadequate intake is how you would see that described in the research and by public health bodies. And the reason for that is there is a big difference between insufficient intake and deficient intake, or having a nutrient deficiency. So like, just in general, if you have a micronutrient deficiency, there will generally be something extremely wrong that's very noticeable. The example I gave in the last episode is with calcium. Like if you have a calcium deficiency, oftentimes one of the first things that'll happen is like there will be errors in kind of like the rhythmicity or signaling in your heart, and like it can cause heart failure.
You would notice that.
If you have insufficient calcium intake, like it's still not ideal, but kind of the normal consequence of that is like you might have a slightly higher risk of osteoporosis over your lifespan.
Yeah.
So two very, very different things. And at least in most developed countries, micronutrient deficiencies are very rare, but insufficiencies are considerably more common. And so in this episode, we're going to talk about the nutrients that people overconsume, but then also underconsume. And when we're talking about like risks or rates of underconsumption of those nutrients, we are talking about insufficient intake, not deficient intake.
Right.
Like an analogy that I think is helpful here is if you think about it in terms of like a car, consuming adequate amounts of a nutrient is like taking extremely good care of a car. Like you're getting top of the line oil, the best tires, the best brakes you can get, always putting in high octane fuel, getting really consistent tune-ups, etc. And like, so, you know, like going, like doing really, really good. Insufficient intake, it's kind of like taking what I would often consider to be like normal care of a car, but
it depends on someone's definition, probably.
Yeah.
Maybe like how a teenager would take care of their car.
Yeah, or just like people of maybe lower socioeconomic status. Like that's kind of my context. But yeah, like, so, you know, you're still taking it in for an oil change every 5,000 miles, but like maybe sometimes you push that to 6,000 or 7,000. Like you're getting the tires changed, but maybe they're getting worn down a little bit too much occasionally. And so like, you know, the consequence there is the car probably won't run quite as well as it would if you took really, really good care of it. And it might break down a little bit. Like it might need to be serviced a little more often. It might end up breaking down a little bit sooner, but like, generally it's still going to have a pretty good life. Like things are going to work pretty well most of the time. And then like deficiency is kind of like just never changing the oil, which like the car will putter along for a while, but eventually like something is going to break very badly and it's going to be fucking obvious. So yeah, like that's, I think, not a terrible analogy.
I like that analogy.
Framing this. Thank you.
I think that's a perfect analogy.
So yeah, like like we're talking about insufficient intake here. We're not talking about deficiencies.
Right.
So for everything we're about to talk about, we're just going to go down a list of things that people might consume a bit too much of, maybe not quite enough of. But everything we're about to cover here, I made a handy table for that will be linked in the show notes if you want to refer back. And you know, like I don't know how long this episode's going to be. Hopefully it's shorter than the last two, but it's probably
we
still...
don't have a great track record with that.
That's true. Like it's probably still going to be at least like 90 to 120 minutes of content. And so yeah, if you'd like a resource that you can glance back at for 30 seconds instead of needing to re-listen to like an hour of content, a table that will like summarize all of this will be linked in the show notes. So yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about 3 groups of micronutrients to pay close attention to. Nutrients that are often overconsumed, nutrients that are often underconsumed, and nutrients that vegans in particular may want to pay close attention to. So Greg, let's start with those that are overconsumed.
Yeah. So just like one like very small correction there. Some of these that are often overconsumed are just like kind of general nutrients, like not specifically micronutrients, which like very, very small correction, but I don't want anyone writing in and being like, Greg said saturated fat was a micronutrient. Anyway, like we understand the distinction, but yeah, so in kind of the standard Western diet, there are a handful of nutrients that are often overconsumed, and there are a couple that I think a lot of people believe are frequently overconsumed, but maybe aren't so much, and I'm going to touch on those as well. But the first on this list is added sugar. The recommended intake differs depending on what source you look at, but the USDA here in the US recommends added sugar to comprise less than 10% of total energy intake. The American Heart Association recommends less than 5% of total intake, of total energy intake. Actually, I don't think that was their exact recommendation. I think they recommended like a number of grams per day to stay below, but it was consistent with like a 2,000 calorie diet for women, 2,500 calorie diet for men, and it would be like less than 5% of energy in those two diets. So just kind of like abstracting it like less than 5% of total energy. And the British NHS recommends to keep it below 30 grams per day. So like, don't consume a ton of added sugar. Like that's the basic takeaway. And the average intake in most of the developed world, like it differs country to country, but it's somewhere around like 8 to 15%. So like some countries in Europe are down closer to like 8-9%, which would kind of come in under that recommendation from the USDA, but would still exceed the American Heart Association and the NHS's recommendation. 15% that's like quite a lot. Like 15% doesn't sound like a big number, but that's basically like a sixth of your total energy intake from added sugar. Also, I think that there is the general perception that added sugar intake is increasing over time, and that's like driving a lot of disease burden and whatnot. And like added sugar intake is generally still too high, but it's actually trending down. Like it peaked in the early to mid 2000s, and as there has been more awareness about, hey, maybe don't consume that much sugar, it is like gradually trending down. But on average, a lot of people are still consuming too much of it. Moving on, saturated fat. The recommended intake from most health bodies is to keep saturated fat intake as low as possible, but to definitely try to keep it below 10% of total energy intake. The average intake in both the US and EU is higher than that. And in America specifically, only about a third of Americans meet that recommendation to keep it below 10%. And I'll note about this, like, this recommendation is more controversial than I think it should be. Like, there is, in kind of like the online fitness and nutrition space, a relatively large group of folks who try to push the idea that all of that is bullshit and saturated fat is totally fine, doesn't increase your risk of cardiovascular disease, might increase your LDL cholesterol, but like that's irrelevant.
Yikes.
And like this isn't like, I'm probably not the person to do like an in-depth episode on this, and like this definitely isn't the podcast episode to get super in-depth on this topic, but like that's just fucking wrong.
Yeah.
Like, so kind of starting with epidemiological research, and like the stuff I'm about to reference will be linked in the show notes. Higher intakes of saturated fat are associated with greater risks of cardiovascular disease. Greater intakes of saturated fat like directly increase LDL cholesterol. And there's also like pretty strong meta-analytic evidence that lowering LDL cholesterol reduces rates of cardiovascular disease in a predictable way with like a strong dose-response relationship, which like very, very, very strongly suggests that we're dealing with a causal relationship here. So yeah, like limiting saturated fat intake is a good thing. Yeah, more people should probably pay a bit of mind to that, because most people do seem to overconsume it. Moving on, another one that might be like somewhat controversial, and I understand the controversy around this one a bit more, and that is sodium. So like different public health bodies have different recommendations for sodium, but most of them suggest that sodium intake should be somewhere around like 2.5 grams per day. So like 2,000 to 2,500 milligrams per day. Like it's usually expressed in milligrams. And average intake in most developed countries is like way, way higher than that.
Yeah.
For understandable reasons, like well-seasoned food is delicious.
Yeah. Just tastes better.
Yeah. So one perspective on this is that recommendation is too low, or at least should be kind of like circumscribed a bit more and like given like more kind of like context around it. So some folks will make the case that the only reason that you should worry about sodium intake is if you have high blood pressure and like sodium sensitive hypertension in particular. And a lot of people have hypertension, but not every hypertensive person has like sodium sensitive hypertension. And so they would suggest that like most people are fine to consume a lot of sodium, but like consuming a lot of sodium has like excess deleterious effects specifically for sodium sensitive hypertensives.
Yeah.
So that's one way to look at it. And that is, I don't know, until about a year ago, I think kind of the camp that I was in. And I'm still sympathetic to that way of viewing things.
But you left the camp. Are you trekking to a new camp?
I don't know. Like I don't think I have a strong take on it anymore.
Okay.
So there was a meta-analysis that came out like last year, 2 years ago, like relatively recently, that suggests that high sodium intake is related to like stroke risk. And there's also like quite a bit of animal research that's being done, finding that high salt intake is like mechanistically linked to like disease mechanisms related to the kidneys, brain, vascular, and immune systems. And so like that stuff will be linked in the show notes as well. And so like you don't want to draw like too straight of a line between animal research and human health outcomes. And the stuff with stroke risk, like it could be similar to the sodium sensitive hypertension thing, where like hypertension is a risk factor for having strokes. So it could just be that people who consume a lot of sodium, most of them are fine. They're not actually elevating their individual stroke risk, but kind of on a population level, you're consuming more salt. Some of those people will be more sodium sensitive, and they have an individual like large elevation in stroke risk, and so you get kind of those epidemiological trends. Like that is certainly a possibility, or some more of like the animal mechanistic stuff could be at play here, and there is like a driving causal factor beyond simply potential effects on blood pressure. So yeah, like I'm sort of in the middle of those two perspectives right now. Like it's something that, to have a strong take, I feel like I would need to dig much deeper into the research than I have to this point had time to dig.
Have you changed your sodium intake or your personal habits in the last year? Yeah.
No. Yeah, I'm not concerned enough to modify my own salt intake. But, you know, that may be one of the reasons, like just being completely transparent, that may be one of the reasons I haven't dug into this more, because like I like salty food, and I don't want to be worried every time I eat salty food. So yeah, whatever. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, just in general, like given the public health guidelines related to sodium, like most people do overconsume it. So those are the three that are where overconsumption is like very common. There are two nutrients here that I suspect a lot of listeners would have expected me to include on this list that I did not. And the first potentially controversial exclusion is omega-6s. And the reason I say that's potentially controversial is there's currently a lot of panic about seed oils. And like omega-6 fats, like linoleic acid in particular, is like the dominant fat in seed oils. And this is also not the episode to get super into seed oils. But yeah, so the reasons that people are concerned about it is, I think that there's the general perception that high intake of omega-6 fats like directly causes an increase in inflammation, which is not necessarily the case. Like it's considerably more complex than that. And I think so like a lot of research like back in the day, maybe like 10-15 years ago, was looking at like omega-3 to omega-6 intake ratios and finding that like a higher ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 intake was associated with higher levels of inflammation. And I think the way that research is kind of leaning now is that when you're dealing with ratios, you have both a numerator and a denominator. Like you're dealing with two numbers. So you could have a high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio if you're consuming a lot of omega-6s, or if you're just not consuming that many omega-3s.
Yeah.
And I think the way that things tend to be leaning now is that like under consuming omega-3s was like the primary driver of those research findings. Like if you consume a lot of omega-6s but also a lot of omega-3s, like that's fine. And if you don't consume that many omega-6s but you also don't consume many omega-3s, like that's also not great. So yeah, that's the first thing. Like the reasons that people are concerned related to inflammation, I think, was largely based on the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio stuff that and it's just an area where like the bulk of the research kind of looks at it with a more like updated, nuanced lens, where it seems to be more about like total omega-3 intake instead of that ratio. And then the other thing is like there are some animal studies that look very scary, and there are some like small cohort studies that some people get concerned about. But like when you zoom out and look at just the totality of the human research, like there are a lot of people consuming a lot of omega-6s out there. And when we look to see what their actual chronic disease burden looks like or what their mortality outcomes look like, Generally, consuming a lot of omega-6s are associated with like pretty neutral effects on health and mortality outcomes, or in the case of some outcomes, like maybe small positive effects. There was a Cochrane review on that in 2018, which will be linked in the show notes. And like I said, this really isn't the episode to get super in depth on this. But if you would like a very in-depth treatment on the kind of like con case for if like the pro case is omega-6s are dangerous and people overconsume seed oils and that's killing everyone, the anti-case for that, there's a really good article on thenutrivore.com about this. And I follow that guy on Twitter, Nick Hebert, and he has been just like, so a lot of the like anti-seed oil folks are just like, it's crazy. Like no one will debate us on this topic from kind of the establishment, the people that hold the view that seed oils are fine. And he responds to all of them. Like I've discovered him because like I followed some of those like quacks that are like super anti-seed oil.
Yeah.
And he just like kept popping up in the responses. I was like, oh, this guy seems like really annoying to people that I find very annoying. So like, let me just follow him,
Yeah.
like see what he's about. And yeah, so everyone who's like, oh, why will no one debate me? He's like, I'll fucking debate you. And all of them turn him down. Anyway, it's just kind of fun. And he has a really good article on his website about seed oils that will be linked in the show notes. The other potentially controversial exclusion for nutrients that are overconsumed is trans fats. Mm-hmm. Not because just consuming a bunch of industrially produced trans fats is good, but because most people don't actually consume like many, if any, industrially produced trans fats anymore. Mm-hmm. This was a fun thing I learned when I was just like doing reading for the like micronutrient pages in the macro factor knowledge base. Most industrialized countries have completely phased out trans fats in foods. So like food manufacturers used to like trans fats because they were cheap to produce and they increased the shelf stability of foods. And they also like they improve like texture and mouthfeel and whatnot. There's some research showing that like, yeah, they're not good. They increase inflammation, they increase heart disease risk, blah, 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 whatever. And for once, the United States actually led the charge on a consumer protection issue, and passed legislation, I think in like 2017, 2018, saying
fairly recently
they need to be phased out. And they did, I think, grant an extension. I think they were supposed to be phased out in 2020, but they ended up being phased out in 2021.
They were like, we need the Crisco during COVID.
I guess so. No, I think it was just like, supply chains are fucked up, whatever. Like we'll give you a bit more leniency. Yeah. But yeah, the EU followed suit soon thereafter, Canada, and I think Australia did as well, and wrapped up their phase out like earlier this year. So yeah, like trans fats just like aren't really much of a thing anymore in most products. Now there is a new like industrial process that has replaced the process of partial hydrogenation, which was what made the trans fats before, which is, I think, biochemically quite interesting. It's called interesterification. So basically, instead of making solid fats with a relatively lower saturated fat because like that was another benefit of trans fats. Like, so trans fats are technically unsaturated fats. Like they're structurally and functionally similar to saturated fats, but they are like they must be unsaturated. Like that's like definitionally what it means. Like you have a like trans a trans configuration of a double bond instead of a cis configuration of a double bond. Like, so they're unsaturated fats. Like consumers had been taught to be fearful of saturated fats. So they gave food manufacturers like a way to put fats in foods that had the same like functional outcomes as saturated fats, like improved shelf stability, blah, 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 whatever. But consumers wouldn't see saturated fat on the food label because they weren't saturated. So interesterification is like a new process that food manufacturers are using to accomplish the same thing, where essentially so triglycerides, which is how most fats are kind of like stored functionally, is a glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acids attached to it. And if you have, I think, 1 saturated fat in the middle of that glycerol backbone and then 2 unsaturated fats, like 1 on either side. So like within the triglyceride, you do have a saturated fat molecule in it. It'll still wind up being solid at room temperature and like behaving as if it was a saturated fat, even though like 2/3 of the actual fatty acids are unsaturated. So that's the process they're using now to kind of create the trans fat like effect without trans fats. And like, I don't know, like biochemically, I can't think of a reason that it would be scary and bad like trans fats were, but who knows, like in 10 years we might find out, that's bad too. But yeah, so that's how they were able to phase out trans fats while still having like another relatively cheap like functional way of accomplishing the same thing. So foods that previously had trans fats, if you're like, I think these fuckers are lying. Like Crisco still seems like Crisco. It must still have trans fats in it. Like, no, like now it's just using interesterified fats. So yeah, I thought that was cool.
You still see, like, I still see trans fats on some food labels, a very small amount, like 0.5 grams or something. Why is that?
Is it yogurt?
Yes.
I'm trying to think of things you eat.
Yeah. Dairy stuff.
So there are naturally occurring trans fats that are mostly, I don't want to overstate it. I think they entirely come from ruminants, but it might just be mostly from ruminants. But yeah, so in like the fermentation process, like in the hind guts of ruminants, like cattle, sheep, goats, whatever, some of those bacteria create some trans fats that the research currently suggests like they're fine, like they're not the primary trans fat. Oh man, I'm doing this from memory. I might be about to fuck it up. But the primary trans fat that was like industrially produced and used in a lot of stuff was called, I think, oleic acid, which was basically the trans version of the like cis fat oleic acid, which is like the primary monounsaturated fat in like olive oil. And so like when you look at the epidemiological research related to like intake of ruminant trans fats versus like oleic acid and the industrially produced trans fats, you don't see the same associations with heart disease from like high intake of dairy products or beef products or whatever, like the foods that do have a little bit of those naturally occurring trans fats in them. But yeah, so like dairy hasn't been outlawed. Like the industrially produced trans fats are what has been done away with. But yeah, like dairy products do have some trans fats in them, but they're like biochemically different. And so far the research doesn't suggest that they have the same deleterious health effects. Yeah.
That's helpful to know. So that if you see that on a label, you're not like, oh no.
Yes.
This company is breaking the law.
Yeah, no, it's probably just a dairy product.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are the nutrients that are overconsumed and the nutrients that aren't probably overconsumed, but a lot of people think they still are. So now let's get into the nutrients that are often underconsumed. And just as kind of a note to frame this, these are based on research looking at intakes relative to typically like EARs. So like how many people are consuming less of a nutrient than the average need for the nutrient in that population. And these are all nutrients that at least 20% of people seem to have insufficient intake of. Again, insufficient, not deficient, big difference. But also don't be like that spooked by it, because if you refer back to the last episode, due to the way that like EARs work, it is entirely possible for 20% of people to consume less of a nutrient than the EAR, but all individuals to actually still be consuming as much as they need, because kind of definitionally about half of people can consume less than the EAR, and that is sufficient for them. So yeah, like I just wanted to make that point. Like, I don't want to over make that point, because it is also like extremely likely that a lot of people do actually have like insufficient intake of these. But yeah, all of which is to say, these are the nutrients that people probably could stand to consume a bit more of. But when you hear like, oh, there are like, how long is this? Like 12, 13 nutrients that like at least 20% of people underconsume. A, that doesn't mean 20% of people are deficient in them.
Right.
And B, that doesn't even mean that 20% of people aren't consuming as much as they need. And it certainly doesn't mean that you are deficient or even insufficient in all of these things. Like just kind of standard caveats on the front end. But these are the ones that if you wanted to track your micronutrient intake in an app, like, for example, maybe MacroFactor, who knows, they would be good ones to keep an eye on. Because like the basic problem we're trying to solve here is there are like in apps with like full robust micronutrient supporting or full robust micronutrient reporting, there are like close to 60 nutrients that you could keep an eye on.
Yeah.
Which is a long list.
Yeah.
And
there's no way you
like,
can focus on all of those.
It would be a very poor use of time to closely monitor your intake for all of these every
insane.
day.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're just trying to kind of help cut it down to a slightly shorter list of if you want to track your micronutrients and focus on them, these might be the ones worth paying like a little bit closer attention to.
Right.
Just to kind of help narrow that focus.
Yeah. So how I'm going to go through these is just to give the nutrient and then to just give some good sources of that nutrient. And again, the resource that Greg put together for the MacroFactor knowledge base has all of this information for each nutrient. So that's a good thing to reference back to if you don't want to be like furiously taking notes about foods for each of these nutrients. But I'm going to start with fiber. I feel like that's one of the ones that we hear about the most. A lot of people want to track fiber alongside the main macronutrients. So
actually,
go ahead.
Can I just make one more tiny note?
Of course.
Okay, so these lists of like good food sources for each of these nutrients, where that came from is in MacroFactor, like the main source we have for foods with like full robust micronutrient reporting is the NCCDB, which is a like research grade food database maintained by the University of Minnesota, I believe.
I think that's right, yeah.
But yeah, like it's kind of like the gold standard database for like foods with full micronutrient reporting. And so where this came from is like we have the CSV file for that. And don't ask me to share it with you. Like I will not. We are we are contractually not allowed to. But B, like what I did is essentially just kind of like normalized everything per 100 calories.
Right.
And then just like sorted the CSV by D's. Yeah. That would be by descending. So it's just kind of like, it's not every food in existence, but it's most whole foods that exist. And it's just kind of like the foods that have the highest density of these nutrients per 100 calories of total intake. So if, for instance, you're trying to increase your intake of one of these, but you don't want to just consume like a ton of calories in the process, like, you know,
right.
for instance, like fatty beef it has some zinc in it, and you can get plenty of zinc intake from beef. But yeah, you might have to consume like 700 calories of beef or whatever. Whereas there are foods that are like considerably more energy sparse that have like higher densities of this. And that's important context to give, mostly because as you're listening to this, you will notice that things like nuts and seeds, which are really good sources of a lot of micronutrients, won't show up on these lists. And that's just because like they're also relatively energy dense. So yeah, like just to note the methodology.
Yeah.
Because like if there are some foods that are excluded that you would expect, like, oh, hey, I know such and such is a good source of vitamin E. Why was it not on the list? It's typically because it's just like relatively energy dense. And so this is like both micronutrient density, but also like energy sparsity. Like those are the two things that are accounted for with the methodology I used.
Yeah, that's important to note. Yeah. Okay, so for fiber, per 100 calories, some of the best sources of dietary fiber are artichoke, which has 20.9 grams per 100 calories, which is a lot.
That's a ton.
Rhubarb has 20 grams. Turnip greens, 17.5. And then just a couple more that are below that, but above 10 grams per 100 calories. Sauerkraut, jicama, banana peppers, raspberries and blackberries, lettuce, and collard greens.
Hell yeah.
So just good stuff, fruits and vegetables. Omega-3s is the next one, in particular EPA and DHA. So you mentioned omega-3s just a minute ago when we were talking about omega-6s. But some good sources of omega-3s are caviar and other fish eggs and seal fat. Those are at the top of the list with more than 2 grams of combined EPA and DHA per 100 calories. But that's not exactly like super actionable for a lot of people. I don't know anyone who's like, oh yeah, I'll just consume more seal fat, easy.
So a fun thing to note as I was putting together the micronutrient content for the knowledge base, I edited most of these out, but for a lot of nutrients, the best sources were either the meat or fat from bearded seals or like whale meat or whale blubber, which like those aren't like accessible nutrients for most people. Like especially for like when I was going through the individual amino acids, dude, like bearded seal and like whale meat are like super good sources of most essential amino acids, but I also think they're illegal to hunt. So like I'm not sure why they were in the database in the first place. But yeah, they seem to be nutrient powerhouses, which was interesting.
Yeah. Cod liver oil is a classic EPA and DHA powerhouse. But in terms of more readily accessible foods, it's just a lot of seafood. So salmon, mackerel, sardines, anchovies, Pacific oysters, fatty tuna are all particularly high in EPA and DHA, with 0.8 to 1.3 grams of combined EPA and DHA per 100 calories.
Yep. Just most like cold water fatty fish.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to go through some vitamins next. So vitamin A, liver has by far the highest vitamin A concentrations, as we talked a little bit about last episode when Greg went on his rant about bears. But fatty fish, eel, yogurt, and dairy products are also great sources of vitamin A. Vegan sources of vitamin A are generally rich in carotenoids. That's how you say that, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Rather than retinol. So that's like lettuces, peppers, sweet potatoes, spinach and other leafy greens, pumpkin, and carrots. Vitamin B6, peppers, liver, cabbage, watercress. Watercress is one that showed up a lot in your research. Like that is like, I don't like the term superfood, but if we want to be calling out superfoods, it's watercress.
Yeah, I also like removed it from some of the lists for like some of the nutrients.
Yeah, because you're just like, God damn it, it's for all of them.
Well, yeah, I was like, if people are looking through this, I don't want them to think that like I'm telling them they need to eat this like little microgreen, like I'm some little fancy boy.
You're sponsored by Big Watercress.
Yeah, but like watercress is like astoundingly nutrient dense. But again, like this is per 100 calories, and it's also very energy sparse. Right. So like that's
because it's just a green. Yeah. So other B6, zucchini, other leafy greens, okra, garlic, tuna, cauliflower, mushrooms, turkey, and salmon. Next up is folate. So great sources of folate include green leafies. Once again, you Get your green leafies, spinach, lettuce, turnip greens, arugula, collards, mustard greens, asparagus, yeast products, Chinese cabbage, specifically Chinese cabbage, kelp and seaweed, nori. So nori is another one that showed up a lot for you, right?
Yes.
That's another quote superfood.
Yeah. It showed up all the time. Yeah, I mean, it's the bottom. I mean, like, it's seaweeds and algae are kind of like the base of the marine ecosystem. Like we talked about bioaccumulation in the last episode as well. And like, when people say like seafood is good for you generally, like folks who aren't like super informed about nutrition, oftentimes do generally have the idea that like seafood is good.
Right.
And a lot of that just has to do with the fact that like the base of the marine ecosystem, like it's mostly seaweeds and algae, whereas the base of like the terrestrial ecosystem tends to be like leaves and grasses.
Yeah.
And when you compare the two, like seaweeds and algae are just like generally more nutrient dense than like leaves and grasses are.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's good stuff.
Should start feeding all of the land mammals or like the land animals that we eat watercress. See what happens.
Maybe. I don't think that would be very like economically efficient.
I know. Maybe an experiment someone can run if they just have like a couple farm animals they keep.
That would be fun, yeah.
Yeah. A couple more for folate I'll give here. Liver, once again, okra, peppers, beets, and cauliflower. Vitamin C. I don't know. What type of cherries are these, Greg?
I would pronounce that acerola or acerola.
How do you know how that's different than regular cherries? Is that what regular cherries are?
Let's see. No, they aren't.
Special cherries.
They are, I think, not actually even cherries.
Oh, wow. I'm glad I asked.
I could be wrong. Yes. It's a fruit similar to a cherry that is not, botanically speaking, actually a cherry. But they're sometimes referred to as Barbados cherries or West Indian cherries. And I think they're just like little fruits that grow in what ocean is that? The Caribbean, like islands in the Caribbean. But yeah, they were the most vitamin C dense food in the database.
All right. So those peppers, watercress, again, guava, most berries, high in vitamin C, citrus fruits, kiwis, and cruciferous vegetables, all great sources of vitamin C. Vitamin D is next. Again, this is especially important for people with darker skin in higher latitudes, which is something we've discussed on the prior episodes. Good sources of vitamin D include mushrooms, fatty fish, dairy products, many of which are also fortified with vitamin D.
Yeah, like so dairy itself isn't particularly rich in vitamin D, but just in terms of like foods you would buy in the store, most dairy products are vitamin D enriched, so they become good sources of vitamin D.
Nice.
Yeah.
Eggs, plant-based dairy replacements that have also been fortified with vitamin D.
Same reason, yeah.
Yeah. And pork products. Most food sources of vitamin D are animal products. So many vegans, especially vegans who don't consume a lot of mushrooms, benefit from vitamin D supplementation.
Yeah, mushrooms also come in clutch. Like you've been calling some stuff out as we go along. But yeah, like mushrooms are full of a lot of just like weird nutrients that people often don't think about. And particularly if you don't consume animal products, mushrooms tend to have a lot of the stuff that might be more challenging to consume in a vegan diet.
Mushrooms are great. If you're vegan and you're not eating mushrooms, that's sad.
Or if you're an omnivore and you're not eating mushrooms,
also sad.
They're delicious and so versatile. And another thing I'll add, if you're not a good cook, mushrooms are a great thing to cook to kind of get your feet wet. Because it's so hard to fuck up mushrooms. Because like with like animal products, for instance, like meat, If you overcook it, it just like gets really dry and it's disgusting. Vegetables, you overcook them, they get like really mushy, also kind of disgusting. Mushrooms, since like due to the way that like their protein structure is, if you cooked them for like days, eventually it would break down and they'd go mushy. But it's very hard to overcook them and dry them out like meat. And it's also like tremendously difficult to overcook them and make them go mushy. Like they just have like a very robust protein structure that is extremely resilient to undercooking, overcooking, whatever. So yeah, like they're a good food to like just practice cooking. Because you have so much leeway. Like it's so hard to fuck up mushrooms.
Yeah, I feel like they're really good at absorbing flavor too, which is another reason they would be good to practice cooking with.
Yeah, like they're
like,
little sponges.
Yeah, see how flavor combinations work. Yeah. Okay, next one is vitamin E. Though Greg says he's not totally sold on that one, so we're gonna kick it over to him in just a second. But some good sources of vitamin E are nuts, seeds, peppers, green leafy vegetables, tomatoes, and wheat germ. Many oils are also fortified with vitamin E to prevent degradation during cooking.
Yes. So like you mentioned, I am skeptical about vitamin E. And thank you actually to one of the Macro Factor developers, Corey, for bringing this to my attention. Because when he was working on the micronutrient features in Macro Factor and he started monitoring his intake more closely, he realized that he was, like most people, under consuming vitamin E, like given the intake targets that public health bodies propose for vitamin E. And he also looked around. He's like, it seems like none of the foods I or most people eat are that rich in vitamin E. Like the things you listed here, like nuts, seeds, peppers, green leafies, whatever, they do have some vitamin E in them. But like the fact that like nuts and seeds are at the top,
right,
in spite of being quite energy dense, should suggest that like it's pretty difficult to consume a lot of vitamin E in your diet without just eating like 1,400 calories of nuts a day, which like most people aren't doing. So, you know, it's like, hey, what gives? And so, he asked me about that. I'm like, that's an interesting question. I'll look into it more. And I came across a publication from the EFSA, which is like the European body that sets their micronutrient targets, the European Food and Safety Authority. And here is a quote from their publication, where they like set their AIs for vitamin E. So here's the quote. The classification of vitamin E as an essential nutrient is based on animal studies and primary and secondary alpha-tocopherol deficiency in humans. The need for alpha-tocopherol, which is like the primary source, like this is not from the quote anymore. Alpha-tocopherol is kind of like the scientific name for, there are like multiple chemical compounds that fall under the umbrella of vitamin E, but like alpha-tocopherol is like the main one. Okay. Just so people listening will know what they're talking about. The need for alpha-tocopherol in order to prevent fetal reabsorption in pregnant rats fed lard-containing diets is the origin of the discovery of the vitamin. The chemical name tocopherol derives from its essentiality for normal reproduction in animals, even though the essentiality for this function has never been demonstrated in humans. Symptomatic alpha-tocopherol deficiency in individuals without any disease and who consume diets low in alpha-tocopherol has never been reported. So here's maybe my hottest micronutrient take. Wow. I kind of think that vitamin E should be considered a conditionally essential nutrient. Yeah. So yeah, like basically to break that down and just provide a little more context, like it is definitely like something you need. So like people who have like genetic conditions that create like errors in vitamin E metabolism, or people who have like intestinal disorders or like conditions that inhibit or completely prevent the absorption of vitamin E do suffer health consequences as a result of like not having enough vitamin E in their body. But for people who are generally healthy, don't have those genetic conditions that interfere with vitamin E metabolism, don't have any like gastrointestinal issues that prevent the absorption of vitamin E, even when people like consume extremely low amounts of vitamin E in their diet, like they seem fine.
Yeah.
So yeah, it seems like most people don't need to worry about vitamin E intake, in spite of the fact that, like, as alluded to at the start of this story, the like AI, like the adequate intake value for vitamin E is quite high. So like, I'm not totally sure where that disconnect comes from, but basically, like, vitamin E is on the list of nutrients that, according to the intake targets that public health bodies propose, it seems like the vast majority of people underconsume. But I'm actually not so sure that most or like hardly anyone actually underconsumes it, because like,
right. It sounds like it might not even be essential.
Well, no, like it is essential. Like,
okay.
If you fed someone a completely vitamin E deficient diet, like no vitamin E whatsoever, like bad things would happen.
Okay.
But like there's a little bit of vitamin E in like a lot of stuff. It seems like if you consume a little bit of vitamin E, like you're fine.
Okay.
Anyway, so yeah, like it is on this list because I applied the same methodology to everything. Like there's research on like rates of insufficient consumption of various essential nutrients, and like vitamin E shows up on those lists. But I just wanted to voice my skepticism about whether it should be on that list and whether it should even be considered like an essential nutrient for everyone in the first place. Because like most people just don't need to worry about it.
Right. That's what I was saying when I said not essential. Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to the next vitamin, which is vitamin K.
Yes.
Sometimes referred to as K1 and K2. Those are the two types. They have similar biological functions. Green leafy vegetables are by far the best source of vitamin K1, and some fermented foods, most notably natto, which is a Japanese fermented soybean product. Those fermented foods are the best sources of vitamin K2.
Mm-hmm.
Next up is choline. So egg yolks, fish, liver, and shellfish are all particularly good sources of choline. Legumes in general and soybeans in particular are good vegan sources of choline. So those are our vitamins. Mm-hmm. And now we are on to minerals. First up is magnesium. Good sources of magnesium include green leafy vegetables like chard and spinach, rhubarb, okra, soy products, whole grain products, and many nuts and seeds. Mm-hmm. Potassium is next. So once again, green leafy vegetables. Eat your green leafies. Mushrooms, root vegetables like potatoes and beets. Tomatoes, various squashes, including pumpkin, summer squash, acorn squash, and zucchini. Asparagus, peppers, okra, cruciferous vegetables, beans, and most fruits are great sources of potassium. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of things for potassium.
Yeah, like it's
basically most plants.
Yeah, just like most plant products.
Yeah. With the exception of nuts, seeds, and grains, most plant products, pretty good sources of potassium. And last up is zinc. So shellfish, mushrooms, liver, dried seaweed, once again, nori, beef, green leafy vegetables, whole grain products, particularly the bran, and some seeds, all good sources of zinc.
Absolutely.
And so that was our second category of things that are often underconsumed. Mm-hmm. Now we're moving on to our third. The last category is vegans, the nutrients that vegans in particular may want to pay close attention to.
Yes. So just at the start of this, I will acknowledge that we on this podcast are both omnivores, and I know a lot of vegans are sensitive to omnivores who are trying to be well-meaning, lecturing them about, like, don't go vegan, like it's so hard to consume a nutritionally complete diet. Where's the protein coming from? Like blah, 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 whatever.
Yeah.
We're not on that tip. Like we have absolutely no issue with people being vegan and certainly not trying to harangue anyone about that. But it is also true that certain nutrients do predominantly come from animal products. And so like, yeah, it's absolutely possible to consume a very healthy and nutritionally complete vegan diet, but like certain nutrients, it might take a little bit more planning. And when you look at the research on like rates of insufficient intake for particular nutrients, there are some where rates of insufficient intake are quite a bit higher for vegans than for omnivores. So yeah, that's what we're going to talk about. So the first is EPA and DHA, like the two kind of most important omega-3s. Because again, like most of the best sources of EPA and DHA are like cold water fatty fish. But if you're not going to consume them and you also don't want to consume fish oil because like you're very strict about your veganism, totally understandable. It's probably not a bad idea to look into an algae oil supplement. Again, going back to the idea of bioaccumulation, most of the omega-3s that would show up in a salmon in the first place did start in an algae. So yeah, it's I think a little bit less efficient to produce algae oil, and therefore like it's a little bit more expensive than fish oil would be. But like it contains the same EPA and DHA. Probably a decent thing to look into. The next one, which like I'm sure some eyes will be rolling when I mention this, I'm not going to harp on it, is maybe some individual essential amino acids. Although I will note, the vast majority of the time, this is not something most vegans need to worry about. If you consume a varied diet, or if you consume like plant-based products that do have like a full essential amino acid profile. So like if you consume soy, if you consume like plenty of mushrooms, although I know they're not a plant, fungi, different kingdom of life. But yeah, like fungi and soy, they have the full complement of essential amino acids. You consume some of those, like you're definitely good. Or if you don't, but you consume a generally varied diet, you will also be good. But like if you're kind of lazy about your intake and like don't have that varied of a diet, you might be under consuming some essential amino acids. So like for instance, if you have an extremely grain-based diet, you might want to keep an eye out for lysine and maybe like make a point of consuming some vegan protein sources that have some lysine in them. Or if you just have like a very legume-rich diet and not much else, you might have difficulty consuming enough methionine. But like that's why the combination of rice and beans is like the classic poverty food, because rice, like it's a cereal grain, beans, legumes, obviously. Legumes, not much methionine, plenty of lysine, vice versa for rice. So yeah, like if you consume some soy products or mushrooms, or just like don't only eat like one food, like you probably don't need to worry about it, but like that is technically a higher risk with a vegan diet than an omnivorous diet. Moving on to vitamins, really the biggest one to pay mind to is vitamin B12. Like we mentioned in the last episode, like virtually all of the B12 that's out there comes from ruminants. Like the bacteria in the hindgut of ruminants are really the only things that at scale produce vitamin B12. Like they essentially vitamin B12 is just kind of like a normal vitamin structure with like some cobalt in the mix, and there just aren't that many like enzymes on this earth that can fix cobalt in that vitamin structure to make vitamin B12. And most of the stuff that does do it like lives in the guts of cows or like sheep or goats or whatever. So yeah, like may not be a terrible idea to look at a vegan B12 supplement. And then there are a handful of minerals that it might be worth paying a bit of attention to. Those would be calcium, iron, zinc, and selenium. And calcium, iron, and zinc are kind of grouped together. With calcium, it's mostly a matter of the fact that like there aren't that many plant-based products that are rich in calcium, and most of the ones that are, like most calcium in the human diet comes from dairy products. And most of the plant-based foods that are rich in calcium are also relatively rich in oxalates and phytates, which inhibit the absorption of calcium. Similar with iron as well. So most iron-rich plant-based foods are also rich in oxalates and phytates. Same thing, like it chelates the iron, like inhibits the absorption. And just like plant, like heme-bound iron tends to be more like orally bioavailable. And similar with zinc as well. The other mineral that's kind of like affected by the same like set of circumstances where foods that are rich in it also tend to be rich in phytates and oxalates is magnesium. But like vegans don't need to worry about magnesium intake more than anyone else does. And the main reason for that is like basically every magnesium rich food is like a plant food in the first place.
Right.
But yeah, calcium, iron, zinc might be worth paying attention to. Like a lot of the richest sources of those minerals are animal products, and a lot of the plant products, like the nutrients themselves, might be slightly less bioavailable. And then the last one, for reasons that I'm not totally sure of, is selenium. Like most good sources of selenium are also plant products, but research on just kind of like blood biomarkers of micronutrient status tends to find that vegans have like lower selenium levels than omnivores do. So yeah, those are the ones to look out for. But with most of them, like mushrooms and soy products help a lot. And for selenium specifically, just like eat a couple Brazil nuts from time to time. Most nuts are very poor in selenium. Brazil nuts are like extremely rich in selenium. Not totally sure why, but do you know what Brazil nuts are, Linz?
The big ones.
Yes. I love Brazil nuts.
They're pretty good. I always used to pick those out of like the nut mixes that my parents would get.
Same.
They're good.
Yeah. Did they have shell on or shell off?
Off.
Okay. We got the shell on nut mix around like Christmas time every year.
Oh my gosh. That's so much work.
Well, it was so like we started getting them when I was like a little guy, like little. And so like I remember, so I've always been kind of like weirdly obsessed with like testing how strong I was. Like it's not a mistake that I found powerlifting. And so like we had these little nutcrackers, and every year I was like interested to see like, ooh, can I crack more nuts now than I could last year?
Oh my gosh.
Cause like the easiest ones were like walnuts. Like they're big, but like they have relatively thin shells. Okay. There's a lot of air in them. So like could crack walnuts pretty easy. But then like almonds were more difficult, and like Brazil nuts were kind of my white whale. Oh. Because they had the thickest shells that were the hardest to crack.
That makes sense.
And I remember, and I also kind of had it in my mind as a little guy that like the bigger nuts were just like more annoying. I think just because like walnuts, like they were the biggest other than the Brazil nuts. Like they were comparable in size, but like instead of just having like a single thing in there that you could like grab, and like most of the stuff inside was edible. Like almonds, for instance, like smaller, but like you crack it and the interior is just the almond. Like the walnut was kind of like, you know, there was like really bitter kind of like pith, like holding it together, and like the nut was in like multiple parts. I was like, it's kind of annoying. Like I assumed the Brazil nut would be as well. But then when I cracked it, and it was just like a big fucking guy that was like fully like filling out the shell, I was so happy. Yeah. And it was delicious. And so like they are to this day my favorite nut.
How old were you when you could crack open the Brazil nut?
I don't remember.
Like still pretty small, probably.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't like 14, but I was probably 5 or 6. Yeah. But yeah, it was fun.
A lot of snack for less effort once you can do it.
And a very good source of selenium.
Of course, that was really important to you as a 5-year-old.
Yes. No, I had no idea. It will shock you to learn. Okay, let's move on. So, just kind of zooming out, we provided this list, but yeah, if you're going to track your micronutrient intake, just kind of use this list as a starting point, because what you as an individual need to pay attention to will depend like pretty heavily on your own dietary patterns. So like those are the nutrients that like on average tend to be underconsumed in like more developed nations, but you know, your diet may not closely resemble the average diet of wherever you live. And so like, for example, if you don't eat a particularly varied diet, like if you're listening to this and you're like an old school bodybuilder and your diet is 90% just like chicken breast, rice, and broccoli, there might be a lot of micronutrients that you're under consuming. Because like,
we're
like,
leaving out a lot of foods.
Yeah, like the macros of your diet are good, but like there might be some pretty big gaps there. Or just like if you consume a lot of like quote unquote empty calories, like a lot of soda, a lot of like fried food, whatever. The list might be considerably longer for you. Or just if you have food choices that are like way different than the average person, your list might be the same length but different. Or like if you tend to consume a lot of like minimally processed whole foods ingredients, like plenty of mushrooms, plenty of fruits, plenty of vegetables, you might be consuming, like there's a very good chance you're consuming sufficient amounts of like basically every micronutrient, and there might be like one or two that you might want to keep an eye on. All of which is to say, just kind of use this list as a starting point. But what we wanted to do with it is of like the 50 or 60 individual nutrients you could track in an app like MacroFactor, you don't want to pay attention to all of them. So like this kind of is the initial process of helping you narrow that list down a little bit. So yeah, I think that's it for this part of the episode. So let's shift gears. So this whole series has been about micronutrients. And to put a bow on it, I want to take a step back and recommend not getting too fixated on micronutrients and to not fall for the trap of what I like to term micronutrient reductionism. So like humans have a tendency to like numerical targets, or maybe that's not humans. Maybe it's just me and people that listen to this podcast. But yeah, like I like numerical targets, and it can be easy to treat something that you can quantify numerically as like the outcome that matters to you instead of like a proxy for the actual outcome that matters to you. And so like in this case, I think that there's a tendency for people to want to consume a healthy diet. And they're like, okay, well, how can I quantify the healthiness of my diet? And it's hard to put a number on that, but it is easy to put numbers on how much of each micronutrient am I consuming. And so you kind of like operationally define healthy diet as a diet that contains the recommended amount of all essential nutrients. And like in a vacuum, that's fine. But like if you wanted to approach it from the perspective of like, I want to eat enough micronutrients and I'm going to do it by attempting to kind of conform to what's generally recommended as healthy dietary practices, you know, eating a diverse array of minimally processed foods to help you meet those nutrient targets, I think you would have a very hard time not consuming a relatively healthy diet. But it can become problematic when the targets themselves become like you start treating them as your actual goal and metric for success instead of just a proxy for what you're actually pursuing. So in other words, like you might run into problems when a proxy for your goal replaces the actual goal itself. In this case, the proxy is meeting your micronutrient targets and the actual goal is eating a diet that generally promotes good health.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you know, we see this in so many other domains. So like whenever you and I were talking about this before the episode, like it reminds us of people learning that training volume is important for hypertrophy, and then like fixating on getting as much volume and that being the outcome rather than focusing on the outcome of the training volume itself.
Yeah.
Or like in a business, getting fixated on a proxy measure of success, like your Instagram following or your TikTok following, and that leading you to do things like buying followers or like putting out content you're not proud of to optimize for follower count rather than actual business growth.
Yeah.
Like just kind of forgetting the forest and focusing on the trees, forgetting what outcome actually mattered to you at the beginning, and kind of fixating on a proxy.
100%. So yeah, like when you go down this road and you start and your focus shifts excessively towards numerical targets, you might start making choices that are optimized for the pursuit of those targets instead of the pursuit of the actual goal. So like, for instance, you might learn, and like this is true, that your body can like absorb and utilize preformed vitamin A, like retinol, more efficiently than it can carotenoids, which are like provitamin A. Like you absorb them and your body kind of does some metabolic stuff and converts them to vitamin A, but like that's slightly less efficient. And so you might like quote unquote realize that, hey, like vitamin A, that's a fat soluble vitamin. You don't need to consume it every day. There's a shitload of preformed vitamin A in liver. Just eat 1 serving of liver per week. And now you don't need to worry about vitamin A intake. You don't need to worry about consuming anything with carotenoids. Like you're good. Your vitamin A is taken care of. And so you're like, okay, like I don't need to eat like carotenoid rich fruits or vegetables anymore, which in terms of like vitamin A intake in a vacuum, you're 100% right. But there are like plenty of health benefits and just like other beneficial bioactive chemicals in carotenoid rich fruits and vegetables that aren't present in liver. And so, you know, you're ultimately reaching your target, but you're moving further away from theoretically what your goal is, which is trying to eat a healthy diet.
Right.
Or like for a more extreme example of the same concept, and this is related to a question that we were asked a bunch in the groups as we were like putting out this series, and we're going to address it in the context of like a Q&A question at the end of this episode. But multivitamins. Yeah. Like you might start by thinking, hey, I'm going to try to eat a healthy diet that has all of my micronutrients, but then you start getting more like hyper fixated on the micronutrients instead of the healthy diet. And then you realize like, wait a second, I could just have a diet of like French fries and chicken tendies and just like take a multivitamin every day and I'm good.
That's the exact example I was going to give.
Yeah. Like it starts getting warped in that direction. Yeah. Like once you start interpreting healthy diet as just micronutrient complete diet, right, you can eat fucking anything and just take a multivitamin and like you're meeting that goal. Yeah. But like, and we'll talk about this more later, the research on multivitamins isn't like all that promising. And also kind of going back to the carotenoid liver example, there's a ton of healthy stuff in like fruits and vegetables that you're not going to get from tendies and fries, right? That you would just be missing out on if you went that route. And so like, just to give 2 examples, because like it's easy to say like, yeah, there's a lot of healthy stuff in fruits and vegetables other than the micronutrients. But like, I think people tend to like concrete examples. So I'll provide a couple concrete examples. So starting with, more so fruits, but like there's some of these in vegetables as well. Polyphenols. Polyphenols fucking rock. Like I'll link a research review in the show notes for anyone who wants to check it out. Like it's free, full text, easy to read. Yeah, like polyphenols have positive effects on like reducing your risk of neurodegenerative disease, reducing inflammation levels, reducing cancer risk, helping improve cardiovascular health, type 2 diabetes risk and management. And they might also like reduce obesity risk, both from like helping your body like partition nutrients better and also like affecting hunger in a positive way. Like they do a lot of good shit through like a very surprisingly wide array of mechanisms. And they're not micronutrients. Like they're good.
Yeah.
They're good for you. But like going back to the first episode in this series, what micronutrients are, like essential nutrients, are things that if you don't consume them, you will die or suffer like very deleterious health consequences. And like polyphenols aren't essential nutrients. Like if you never ate a blueberry in your life, you'd be fucking fine. Like most people throughout human history never ate a blueberry, believe it or not.
Whoa.
But like it's still good for you. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Yeah. And I like that you're mentioning this as well, because whenever we were going through the list of micronutrients that people might want to pay attention to, a lot of those were just vegetables. Like there weren't as many fruits and like berries and stuff in there. And, you know, whenever you and I were first talking about this, that was surprising to me, because I always thought like, oh, blackberries and like raspberries and stuff like that's super good for you. And yeah, they do have micronutrients in them, but it's also like, it's for this reason that they are really, really beneficial.
Yeah. Like,
and if you were just focusing on, oh, what's the most bang for my buck I can get with micronutrient related foods, like you might skip out on some of these benefits.
yeah, for sure. Like just fruits in general, but like berries and like cherries in particular, do have like a ton of beneficial bioactive compounds that aren't like classified as micronutrients. And so, yeah, if you were approaching your diet from the very narrow focus of like only just trying to maximize micronutrient intake, even if you're not going the multivitamin route, like even if you are trying to go like the
Right.
like whole minimally processed food route, like there wouldn't be a great reason to consume berries, because like they tend to be like decent sources of like vitamin K and manganese. And they tend to be like decent sources of vitamin C, but like not so much compared to other foods. Like there are like there are foods that are way richer in like vitamin K, manganese, and vitamin C. So yeah, like you'd look at them and be like, yeah, that's not a micronutrient powerhouse. Like why bother? But like it's the other stuff in them that like aren't micronutrients that tend to make them like particularly beneficial. Now moving over to vegetables, like oftentimes like some of the more like the vegetables that people tend to make like the most health claims about, like that people tend to term like superfoods, which I don't
Kale. That's all everyone ever talks about.
Yeah, like I don't really like that term, but like I see where people are coming from. And like cruciferous vegetables are the ones that people tend to bring up the most. So, you know, broccoli, cauliflower, kale, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, etc.
Lots of brassicas.
Yeah. Oh man, that's a circle square situation, but I forget which one. It's either all brassicas are cruciferous vegetables, but not all cruciferous vegetables are brassicas, or the other way around. It's the first one. It's the first one.
Circle square, rectangle square.
Rectangle square. My bad. Yes. So all brassicas are cruciferous vegetables, but not all cruciferous vegetables are brassicas.
That's right.
Yeah. But yeah, both.
Yes, I only know that because of gardening.
Yes. But yeah, so they're good for you, and they're like a little more micronutrient rich than like berries and cherries are. Like they're decent sources of vitamins C and K. And in particular, like the like green leafy brassicas, like kale, for instance, are like very micronutrient rich and energy sparse. But you know, stuff like, as we were going through the lists of like good sources for like a lot of those nutrients, I don't think like broccoli showed up once, for instance, or if it did, like maybe it only showed up once.
Right. Or Brussels sprouts.
Yeah. Or regular cabbage, only Chinese cabbage.
Right.
And, but yeah, like they do have like some micronutrients, but they're like particularly beneficial due to a class of compounds called isothiocyanates, which are and like I'll link some research related to this as well, but like they have like antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer, and antibacterial properties.
All the antis you want.
Yeah. And you know, like their benefits are borne out both from like epidemiological research, but also like mechanistic stuff. Like it doesn't seem to be like fully just a correlation causation issue. But yeah, like if you were being like really, really intentional about micronutrient intake, yeah, you might still end up eating some cruciferous vegetables, but like not the full range of them, because like only a handful of them would show up on kind of a list of micronutrient powerhouses. But they all have like plenty of isothiocyanates, and like they're all good for you for reasons beyond just their micronutrient content. So yeah, like the basic takeaway here is that you can't reduce the overall like quote unquote healthiness of a diet to its micronutrient content. If you could, again, like a multivitamin would be a wonder drug, but it's not. Like I think it's helpful to look at it through kind of the lens of like necessary versus sufficient. Like eating plenty of micronutrients is necessary for a healthy diet, but it's not sufficient for your diet to be as healthy as it could be. And I think that it's easy to miss that if you become like too target focused.
I think it's easier too, like to just focus on eating a wide variety of foods and not necessarily like fixating on a specific micronutrient target.
Yeah.
You know, like that's also a reason to do it. It's like, it's just like going to be better for your mental health as well as your physical health. Yeah.
But yeah, so that's just kind of like the note that I wanted to end this series on. Like it has been about micronutrients. There's a lot of good stuff related to micronutrients. There are a lot of people who maybe like should pay a little bit more attention to their micronutrient intake, because like if you don't eat a diverse, minimally processed diet, whatever, like there's a non-trivial chance that you probably could consume a bit more of some micronutrients, and that could have some benefits for you. But like if you go that route, basically what I'm saying is don't miss the forest for the trees. Don't reduce the idea of like eating a healthy diet to just a micronutrient complete diet. Like it absolutely goes beyond that. And so yeah, like just kind of, I think you can distill a lot of it down to some general rules or guidelines that most people are probably aware of already. Like eat your protein, eat your fiber. Don't go overboard on added oils and sugars. Make sure you're consuming a variety of fruits and vegetables. And I would also add seaweeds and mushrooms in there if you would like. And yeah, like a healthy diet will generally be a micronutrient rich diet, but don't just assume that a micronutrient complete diet will be the healthiest diet possible. Like don't just fully conflate those two things.
Right. Yeah. Good stuff.
Should
we get into some of these questions from the audience?
Yeah, let's do it. So we have, I think, 4 or 5 questions to round out this episode. Again, these were questions solicited via the Facebook group and subreddit. So if you want to make sure you're aware of like the next time we ask for questions on a particular topic, and therefore increase the probability that your question will be answered on the show, make sure to join the Facebook group and subreddit. And as always, if you have questions you want to ask, record a voice memo, less than 60 seconds, and email it to podcast@strongerbyscience.com. So yeah, let's get into these questions. All right, here's our first question from Ali Shah.
Hey, so my question was, are multivitamins super overrated, or is there actually any use of them? Because I see a lot of people that, kind of, even if they do consume an adequate intake to fruit and vegetables, or if they don't, they say, hey, you should take a multivitamin anyway, just to, kind of cover your bases. Now I was wondering if there's any actual truth to that, or is that completely overrated, not necessary? Do you not even need a multivitamin at all? And if you do you have any recommendations?
All right. Thank you for that question. And I say thanks both on behalf of myself and everyone in the audience, because like I mentioned, that was far and away the most common question we got throughout this series.
Yeah.
So yeah, essentially like are multivitamins overrated? So yeah, I kind of think so, but there's I think a fair bit of nuance in answering this question. So lot of most of the history of multivitamins was marked by very little skepticism towards them. Because like intuitively it makes a lot of sense, right? Like you might not eat a nutritionally complete diet, and if you can just take one little pill a day that kind of serves as an insurance policy, it feels like a no-brainer. And since a lot of people do underconsume a lot of micronutrients, and since underconsumption of micronutrients is implicated in a wide array of disease states, like it seems like a no-brainer that taking a multivitamin should have at worst a neutral effect on like health and mortality outcomes, and more likely than not a positive effect. But I think that started changing in 2013 when a meta-analysis was published that first started like throwing light on this. And I mean, the fact that there was a meta suggests that tells you that there were like individual studies published before this. But I think people previous to this meta just kind of looked at it like, individual studies it might be underpowered, so you're going to get some null results that like aren't real. But yeah, this 2013 meta is highly cited, and I think was very influential for kind of cluing people into the idea that maybe multivitamins aren't actually all that good, like not bad for you, but like probably aren't going to do anything all that great for you. So the title of this meta was Multivitamin, Multimineral Supplementation and Mortality, a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials by McPherson and colleagues, published in the prestigious American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And yeah, so it collated all of the studies looking at the impact of multivitamin supplementation on mortality outcomes. It basically found like nothing. So there was no effect on all-cause mortality. There was not quite a significant effect in primary prevention trials. Like it was kind of like scratching statistical significance, but like the risk ratio is like 0.94. So like even if there was an effect there, we're talking like 6%, like not big. No effect on mortality due to vascular causes, no effect on mortality from cancer, and no statistical evidence of heterogeneity or publication bias. So like
that's brutal.
Yeah, like it threw a lot of cold water on the idea. And since then, I mean, that was 2013. It's 10 years later now. And there's now more like individual research studies. There are more meta-analyses on the topic. There was a really good narrative review from the BMJ in 2020 that I'll link in the show notes. But yeah, like overall, like leading up to 2013 and now since 2013, there's just not all that much promising research on multivitamin use. Like it doesn't seem to, reduce risk of like most diseases, doesn't really seem to affect mortality outcomes, or like if it does, the effect is like pretty small and heterogeneous. Like, yeah, it just doesn't seem all that exciting. So kind of the anti-case here is that, like for a lot of multivitamins, there might be some issues with the types of vitamins or minerals included. So like, for instance, like we talked about this on the last episode, the difference between using like magnesium oxide or like magnesium citrate, like could be the difference between 40% oral bioavailability and like 2%. Yeah. And a lot of them use oxide. Like vitamin D in a lot of multivitamins, they use D2 instead of D3, and like D3 is quite a bit more bioactive. So, it could be that maybe multivitamins could be good, but like a lot of times they like manufacturers kind of cut some corners, use cheaper ingredients, whatever. So like it could be that. Another kind of like anti-multivitamin argument that I've seen, that I'm also quite sympathetic to, is kind of along the lines of what I was talking about at the end of the episode. Like it might promote a bit of laziness in your diet. Like, hey, I'm taking a multivitamin. I don't need to worry that much about eating my fruits and veggies. And so, you might miss out on other benefits of micronutrient rich foods. And then like the biggest thing is, like I mentioned, the data just isn't all that promising. Like, if multivitamins were going to do good shit for you, like, now we have dozens of studies on collectively like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of subjects. If it was going to reduce risk of like cancer or cardiovascular disease or all-cause mortality or whatever, like, it should show up in the data by now, but like, it doesn't really. And like, sometimes when you do see an effect, like, it's not like everything is just completely nulls across the board. But even like some of the effects that have been observed are like very small. So, so one of the metas that will be linked in the show notes, 2022 meta published in JAMA. It found like a lower incidence of cancer in people that used multivitamins, but that was just based on 4 RCTs. So like, it's a meta, but like metas can also not have like an extreme amount of precision if it's based on like relatively little data. It was based on less data than a lot of the other outcomes, and the odds ratio is like 0.93. So again, like, if it is like causally reducing risk, it's not reducing it very much. You're seeing mostly nulls, and like the positive effects you do see tend to be quite small. And so, yeah, the basis of the anti-multivitamin case is basically just look at the data. Like, if you're an empiricist, regardless of how good you think multivitamins should be, they don't seem to be doing what you think they should. And then the last thing is like, any intervention carries risk that is often, I think, under-accounted for. So like the classic example of this is like, you would think that like for preventative medicine, just doing like all of the screening possible for everyone all the time would be good and lead to better health outcomes. But like, it often doesn't, because you might get false positives and then like over treat people for things that don't actually need treatment. And so like, yeah, like just risks coming from like excess screening, excess treatment, whatever. And like, that's kind of a generalizable concern with like any type of intervention. So it very well could be that like some small percentage of people do benefit like on an individual level from multivitamin use, but there might be like negative effects for other folks where like maybe if you are consuming enough of most nutrients, but you're just taking like a broad spectrum multivitamin, maybe it's leading to like excess consumption of certain nutrients for some people. And so like in aggregate, maybe it is actually doing some good stuff for some people and some bad stuff for other people. And so it just kind of comes out in the wash. Yeah. But if you yourself aren't like well informed enough to like understand which one of those two groups you'd be falling into, like you might be doing more harm than good to yourself by using something you don't necessarily need to use. So that's kind of the anti-case. The pro case, which like I do think is still a justifiable case to make, is like the first part is like what Ali alluded to. Like, it just seems like a cheap insurance policy. Like, multivitamins are cheap. You might not consume enough of every micronutrient, so like, kind of why not? Which like that is countered by that fourth concern and like the anti-case.
Right.
Well, but you might wind up with like excess consumption. So it's not just strictly an insurance policy. Like it you can't treat it as if it has zero risk, because it does have some risk. The second thing that like the pro case might rest on is someone could say, hey, it might promote laziness in your diet, like you're just taking the multivitamin so you don't worry as much about consuming fruits and vegetables. They could look at the data that exists that shows that like people like consuming multivitamins doesn't seem to increase all-cause mortality, and they could flip that around. They could be like, hey, if this is making people lazier about their diets, but we're not seeing an increase in disease burden or an increase in mortality, and these people are like being lazy with their diets and still having the same health outcomes, that suggests that it is actually working as that insurance policy.
That's true,
like that,
yeah.
That is a case that someone could make. Another thing someone could bring up when looking at the data is just kind of like a methodological point, which is that a lot of the research, like not all of it, but like most of the research looking at multivitamins and like health outcomes is focused on kind of like broad stuff. So like total incidence of cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular disease mortality, total incidence of cancer or cancer mortality, and just all-cause mortality. And like we are getting more research on like individual diseases or like individual like kind of more narrow health outcomes, but like that research is lagging behind the stuff on, say, just like all-cause mortality. And so there very well could be benefits that the research hasn't picked up on yet because it wasn't designed to look at some of those other outcomes. So like, for instance, like this isn't necessarily multivitamins, but like calcium and vitamin D are two things you'll find in basically every multivitamin. And like there is research showing that calcium and vitamin D supplementation does seem to help decrease risk of fractures in people with osteoporosis. So like, you know, you could do targeted supplementation when someone's like diagnosed with a disease like osteoporosis, say like, oh, hey, you've been diagnosed with this thing, start taking calcium and vitamin D. But if you're looking at it through the lens of insurance policy, you could say, hey, a lot of people are going to get osteoporosis. And just if all of them were taking multivitamins, they wouldn't need to worry about like this targeted supplementation when they get that diagnosis. Like their bases would already be covered. Like it would be serving its role as an insurance policy. And yeah, so like there's just not much research on kind of more specific disease outcomes. Like most of it is on like general stuff. So like there might just be benefits that the research isn't currently picking up on. Mm-hmm. Another thing that someone could point out as just another methodological thing is that most of the RCTs on multivitamins are in older adults and are like relatively short term. We're not talking short term like 6 weeks like a hypertrophy study might be, but like for instance that 2013 review that I think kind of clued people into the idea that maybe multivitamins aren't all they're cracked up to be. In that review, the average age of the subjects was 62 and the average length of supplementation was 43 months. And it was looking at stuff like cardiovascular disease and cancer, which like diseases like that, and I mean like most chronic diseases that ultimately result in mortality, like all-cause mortality, are at least in part a result of like the sum total of actions in your life.
Yeah.
And like I don't want to say like that's exclusively what it is. Like there are genetic predispositions, mm-hmm. There's stuff outside your control, but like in terms of the things that are in your control, like mm-hmm. it's a cumulative progressive thing.
Right. A snapshot in your 60s
right.
might not necessarily be very informative.
Correct. And so like if you were trying to make the pro multivitamin case, you could say like, hey, maybe they could do some good stuff, but like if people started taking one a day in their 20s mm-hmm. and carried that throughout their life, it would have positive effects. But by the time someone's starting to take them in their 60s, maybe like quote unquote the damage is already done. And like even if they were theoretically having some positive effects, it's like, hey, they're not going to like decalcify your arteries. Like you're mostly to the way to that heart attack anyways. Yeah. And like maybe it pushes it off by like a month. Whereas if you've been taking them for 50 years, maybe it would push it back 5 years. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like I'm not saying that's the case, but like that is like a methodological right. consideration someone could bring up. And like I'll also note, like for something that I'm far more sympathetic to, exercise. Like I think exercise is good for you. And if you exercise consistently throughout your life, you'll live longer. Mm-hmm. But like, if you wanted to apply the same sort of methodological considerations to exercise outcomes, mm-hmm. the epidemiological stuff looks really good. Like folks who exercise have like lower rates of all-cause mortality and like lower rates of most disease outcomes than people that don't. But RCTs, where you take people who are already in their 60s and 70s and get them to start exercising, there's not a ton of good evidence showing that it makes people live like dramatically longer. For I think like similar reasons. Like I do think it like causally makes you healthier and causally helps you live longer.
Right. But
if you already have like 60 years of progression towards the disease that's ultimately going to result in your demise, I'm like, not to be too fucking morbid about it, but like starting to exercise then I think will probably have a positive effect. But like the research doesn't suggest that it's like that large of an effect.
Yes.
And so it could be a similar thing going on with multivitamins. And then the last thing is, and this is from the 2020 BMJ narrative review. This is a quote. People using supplements tend to be older, female, and have higher education, income, and healthier lifestyles than people who do not use them. It's like that kind of pushes back against the idea that like it just makes people lazy with their diet. It seems to be more like folks who are interested in their health are doing this other thing that they think will improve their health.
Right.
But also that might set you up with like a situation where you're not necessarily dealing with the ideal population to detect an effect. Because
they're already doing a lot of other healthy behaviors.
They're doing a lot of other good shit.
Yeah.
And like they might already be like more likely to be consuming a micronutrient sufficient diet.
Right.
And so the ones that take a multivitamin might not actually wind up with like fewer micronutrient gaps in their diet than the people who aren't.
Yeah.
Like just due to the population you're dealing with. So yeah, like on balance, I don't think multivitamins are as much of a no-brainer as they would seem to be if you hadn't looked into this topic much. But I've also seen some people who are like stridently anti-multivitamin, like approaching it from the perspective of like, there is no justifiable, cognizable reason for anyone to ever use a multivitamin. It's like it's definitely a waste of money, and we have enough research and the right type of research to be like very, very confident that that is the case. And I'm not quite there yet. Like, I think those folks might be overplaying their hand a little bit. And maybe failing to recognize some of the drawbacks that are present in the current base of evidence that we have on multivitamins. So yeah, like, I don't know. I don't know if that's the answer that Ali was looking for. But yeah, like I would say in aggregate, I mean, I don't know. I think the saying like actions speak louder than words, kind of like me still consuming plenty of sodium. Like, I don't take a multivitamin.
Yes. And you also, like, I have talked about taking a multivitamin before, and you have advised me to not worry about it. And I think that speaks even louder than what you do yourself. Yeah,
I like you more than I like myself. Yeah, like I am, I think, more in the anti-multivitamin camp. Like I personally don't think they do much, if anything, but I'm not like incredibly confident about that. Like I do think that there are still some gaps in the research that I would like to see addressed. Okay, next question from Stephanie Grace Foltz.
Hey Greg and Lyndsey, my name's Stephanie Grace Foltz. My question is about vitamin D. So Barbell Medicine stated somewhere that low vitamin D is normally the result of another health problem. So normally like low vitamin D by itself isn't a problem. It's the result of another problem. So one, am I understanding that right? And two, why would a healthy person have low vitamin D? I'm asking this because my blood work came back that I have low vitamin D, and it's been tested multiple times, and I refuse to supplement because I just don't feel like dealing with it. But I sleep well, I eat well, I lift weights, I do cardio, I don't have any underlying health problems that I know of. So I'm just curious why the heck I have low vitamin D. Thanks so much, and I love the show. Lyndsey, you're killing it, girl.
All right. Thank you for that question. And so let me first say that I hope nothing I'm about to say will contradict what the good doctors Jordan and Austin have had to say on the topic. And I will link their podcast episode in the show notes for anyone who wants to listen to it, their podcast episode about vitamin D. But yeah, so I'll answer the second question first, and then just generally talk a little bit about vitamin D and kind of like flesh out the first question that Stephanie had, but probably not fully answer it. So why do you have low vitamin D? Easy answer. I don't fucking know. Like it could be that you don't have that many like rich sources of vitamin D in your diet. It could be that you lead like a generally healthy lifestyle, but I don't know, you're from Massachusetts and you get direct enough sunlight for vitamin D synthesis like 4 months out of the year, and you're not outside all that often. Like those, it could be lifestyle, could be diet, could just be random. Why you as an individual have low vitamin D, I have no earthly idea. And if that's something you want to get to the bottom of, that is something to work on with your doctors. So yeah, then just to kind of talk a little bit more about the first part of that question, the idea that low blood vitamin D is often indicative of poor health rather than the cause of poor health. That is true, and I think it's something that not all that many people are like super aware of. There is like I think there's a movement around what's termed the vitamin D hypothesis, which like most hypotheses in like most like sweeping hypotheses and like health related stuff is like, if it's right to some extent, it's like oversimplified to the point of being wrong.
Yeah.
And it's predicated on the idea that like when you look at epidemiological research at like looking at the association between blood levels of vitamin D, or like the main biomarker you look at, which is serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D, which is often written just 25-OHD or 25-OHD3. Like blood levels of like that particular biomarker of vitamin D are like strongly associated with a ton of positive health outcomes. Like if you have higher blood levels of 25-OHD, like generally you have lower risk of cancer, like lower risk of heart disease, lower risk of like dementia, lower risk of like all-cause mortality, like pretty much any positive health outcome you would want that is associated with higher blood levels of vitamin D. But, classic principle, correlation does not necessarily imply causation, or if you want to get even a little fancier, correlation that does imply causation doesn't necessarily imply the direction of the causation. And in this case, I kind of think it's bidirectional. Like sometimes if your like blood levels of vitamin D are too low, like that could be a causal factor in disease progression or like the risk of like developing a disease in the first place. But also like Stephanie alluded to, oftentimes low blood levels of vitamin D aren't the cause of a disease, but are like indicative of disease states or like poor health. So yeah, like the most basic epidemiological research finds like positive associations between high blood levels of vitamin D and all sorts of positive outcomes. But when you go like one step deeper, there's not a super strong association between dietary vitamin D intake and serum vitamin D status. There's also not a super strong association between sun exposure, even when corrected for like latitude and like skin melanation and all of that, and serum vitamin D status. Like the association's there, but like it's not as strong as one would anticipate, just kind of like going down like the causal chain that one would think. RCTs testing the effects of increased sun exposure and increased vitamin D intake on vitamin D status generally do find increases in serum vitamin D, but the increase usually isn't particularly large and it tends to be highly variable. And in general, it mostly seems to be effective for people who have like really low serum levels in the first place. So like, as always, I forget what the units are for this, but like the like number for like blood levels of 25-OHD is like anything under 20 is considered deficient. And like different health bodies have like different numbers they put on this, but like in general, under like 15-20 is considered deficient. Under like 30-40 is considered insufficient. And then a lot of people say like, oh, try to keep it above 50. And some people even say try to keep it above 75. And in general, what you see is like in studies where they look at the effects of increased sun exposure, or just like UV exposure, or increased vitamin D intake on serum vitamin D status, for people who have like serum levels at baseline in the 10, 15, 20 range, you do tend to see increases. But if someone's like in the 25, 30, 35 range, oftentimes it doesn't do anything. Or like if it has an effect, like it's a pretty small effect. Like it doesn't seem like people can reliably, like sun exposure or vitamin D intake their way to serum levels in the 50 to 75 range. So yeah, like it's usually the effect isn't large, tends to be highly variable, and tends to be mostly observed for people who have like the lowest status at baseline. And another complicating factor is like serum vitamin D status isn't always indicative of molecular vitamin D status, which like this one's a bit of a mind fuck, and I'm not going to get into it, but like there have been observed cases of people who have like mild vitamin D toxicity within like particular cell types that like bioaccumulate it, but still like low levels of 25-OHD in the blood. So like the screening test itself might be kind of sketchy for some people, because like there are factors that can influence like cellular accumulation versus like circulating levels in the blood. And also it's likely that causation goes in both directions. So like low vitamin D may be causally linked to some disease, because like vitamin D is a steroid hormone. Like it has direct effects in like almost all cell types, and like it's linked to like it has impacts on like immunity and like things that modulate like inflammatory status and like things that are like either associated with or like causally affect disease progression for some diseases. And so like I do think it is quite possible that like if your vitamin D levels are low enough, that could like causally increase your risk of some diseases. But it is also the case, and I think as Stephanie alluded to, and as Jordan and Alston cover in their episode, it is probably more often the case that like when you get sick, getting sick is what reduces your serum vitamin D levels. Like due to changes in vitamin D metabolism, due to like changes in tissue usage of vitamin D, or potentially due to like secondary behavioral effects. Like, you know, oftentimes if you're sick and like not feeling good, you're not spending a ton of time in the sun.
Right.
And so like it sometimes could be as simple as that. So yeah, like oftentimes low vitamin D is reflective of poor health rather than the cause of poor health. And if that's the case, like consuming more vitamin D may not have much of an impact on your serum levels of vitamin D. But if you have like low vitamin D status because you consume very little vitamin D, or you just get no sun exposure, then consuming more vitamin D and getting more sun exposure will probably help. So yeah, basically like TLDR, it's complicated, and don't construe any of this as medical advice. But yeah, the relationship between like vitamin D intake and vitamin D status is far from a direct one-to-one relationship. And even though like blood levels of vitamin D are associated with your risk of a bunch of diseases, that doesn't necessarily mean that like being in the sun more and consuming more vitamin D will like causally reduce your risk of those diseases, because you could have low vitamin D status because you are already like developing those diseases. And yeah, beyond that, if you want to know what's going on for you as an individual, talk to your doctor, because there are so many like individual discrete things that could be going on. Like I could not possibly know why you have low vitamin D status, and whether that's indicative of low intake or the fact that you're already sick, or like something else, just weird stuff about vitamin D metabolism. Maybe you have a bunch in your cells and not much in your blood. Like I don't know what's going on for any person who wants to know. Yeah.
Thanks for the shout out, Stephanie.
Okay, next question from Joel Phillips. And Stephanie, not thanks for the shout out. If Lyndsey gets too big of a head, she will realize that she's much better than me and leave me alone and desolate. And that is my greatest fear in life. Okay, next question from Joel Phillips.
Hi guys. With micronutrient counting often being laborious, time-consuming, and sometimes infeasible, given a lack of available data for many different foods, are there any good proxy measurements that could help you tell whether you are reaching the recommended targets on average without actually having to meticulously track each food and micronutrient you eat? For example, could you count the grams of vegetables, fruits, and whole grains you eat per day? Or could you eat specific amounts of a few specific vegetables that, when combined, seem to end up hitting most micronutrient targets for most people? Thanks, guys.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. And to answer it, I think not really. At least not a proxy measure I would feel good about. But I'm a stickler for if I'm going to propose something as a proxy measure, it has to be valid and reliable and like blah, blah, blah. And yeah, there's nothing that would clear my bar as a good proxy measure for this. But like in general, to kind of answer the question conceptually, I think that you're in pretty good shape if you consume a diet comprised of whole foods with plenty of fruits, veggies, whole grains, nuts, seeds, mushrooms, etc. Like you're probably in good shape. And if you're consuming like a little bit less of a particular micronutrient than may theoretically be optimal, like you'll probably be close enough that like you won't even notice and like it'll be fine. As to the question about specific foods to maybe pay mind to, we actually mentioned some of them earlier in the episode. So like green leafy vegetables rock, and the ones that show up like most often is like individual green leafy vegetables that are like very micronutrient dense. Spinach, kale, chard, and mustard greens were the ones that showed up a lot. Peppers pop up kind of a lot, and mushrooms as well. And mushrooms like mostly for the weird ones. And shellfish also pops up kind of a lot, particularly for certain minerals, and liver as well. Like in terms of like micronutrient dense animal products, like liver is about as good as you can do. And then also, like we mentioned before, nori shows up a lot, and just kind of like seaweeds and algae in general tend to be quite good if you're looking for just like specific things to check out. And as mentioned previously, don't get like too hyper fixated on that, because like fruits in general and like berries and cherries in particular are really great, but also like aren't that micronutrient dense. So like don't get too focused on just micronutrients, even from like whole food sources, and miss out on some great foods that don't have the highest micronutrient density in existence. Okay, second to last question from Nick.
Hello, my name is Nick and I'm from Germany. My question would be in regards to folic acid supplementation, especially in family planning situations. Here in Europe, you have a lot of FUD in regards to folic acid supplementation when it comes to prenatal and postnatal phases. And the impression is given that women are not even able to conceive when not supplementing with folic acid. My understanding would be that folic acid is mainly needed for establishing the umbilical cord and laying the foundations of the spinal cord, but not much more. It would be great if you could give a rundown on actual supplementation needs, especially in context with a well-balanced or good diet in Western civilizations. Thank you very much and keep up the good work.
All right. So thank you for the question, and I'm going to attempt to answer it without getting myself in too much trouble, because I'm not an OBGYN, and I feel like it will be very challenging to answer this question without it sounding like I'm giving medical advice, which is not my intention. But yeah, so I'll try to talk about this question and this topic in kind of general terms, and hope I don't get too far out over my skis. So just in general, before I start talking about this, I will note some resources that I'll link in the show notes here. One is a good review from 2011 that I think is still like quite up to date. Like I don't think there's been a ton of development in this area since then. But for a more recent source, I'm also going to link like a little back and forth from The Lancet in 2022. There essentially was a review, like a narrative review, like cheerleading the idea that folic acid food fortification should be like mandatory and universal. And there was a letter to the editor disagreeing with that perspective. And it mostly follows the stuff in the 2011 review. But if you're concerned that, there's an expiration date on science, like you're fine with the 2011 review. But if you want something more up to date, there is some stuff from 2022 as well. So yeah, just in general, the main purpose of like recommending folic acid supplementation to women who are, like, depending on the context, either like intentionally trying to become pregnant, or sometimes the recommendation is given just to women of childbearing age who are sexually active and might become pregnant in an unplanned way. But yeah, like it's pretty common for doctors to recommend prenatal vitamins, and kind of they're basically multivitamins, but like the thing that they're like the thing in particular that characterizes them is folic acid fortification. So they tend to have either 400 or 800 micrograms of folic acid, and that is like most health bodies recommend women who are pregnant or trying to become pregnant to take a folic acid supplement. So as you alluded to, Nick, the two main things that's involved with is the development of the umbilical cord, and also like preventing neural tube defects, and more so the neural tube defects than the umbilical cord. And the main one that people are concerned about is spina bifida. Like that's the disease most often resulting from a fetus with a neural tube defect that still goes to term. And so, yeah, like in general, either food fortification with folic acid or like vitamins with folic acid are very effective at preventing most neural tube defects. Like that's not particularly controversial. When folic acid fortification started in the US and like other parts of the developed world, miscarriages due to neural tube defects went down. Babies born with diseases like spina bifida as a result of neural tube defects decreased. Like it works for that purpose. And like it's very much not the case that women can't conceive without taking a folic acid supplement. I mean, like most of the world doesn't have access to folic acid supplements. And, I mean, people in general didn't have folic acid supplements until probably the 60s or 70s. And like, we made it this far as a species. Like a lot of babies are born and have been born without it. Mm-hmm. Although like, I understand that was hyperbole. So the anti-case, like spelled out in the letter to the editor from, in the Lancet in 2022, that will be linked in the show notes, mostly has to do with the fact that, one, although folic acid supplementation is very effective at preventing most neural tube defects themselves are also relatively uncommon. So the estimated like global prevalence of pregnancies with with a fetus with neural tube defects is like about 2 per 1,000 pregnancies. So, you know, it's not like a 1 in a million thing, but it's also not like super common. And there is now starting to be some concern that folic acid supplementation in some cases may do more harm than good. In particular, when it's coupled with like a B12 deficiency. So there's some research in older adults suggesting that folic acid supplementation, when coupled with either a B12 deficiency or just generally low levels of B12 intake, has been linked to cognitive decline. And I think the jury's still out about whether that's a causal relationship or not. And there's also some research from India suggesting that women taking folic acid supplements who also have low B12 status, their children tend to have higher rates of obesity and insulin resistance, which again, like, it's not entirely clear if that's just a correlation or causal. Like, it could be kind of, both of those things could just kind of be correlates with poverty. Like, people who have diets lower in B12, they might have some other factors going on that would like predispose them to increased risk of cognitive decline or obesity or insulin resistance in their children. So like, like it's like the anti-case, I don't think is like ironclad, but like there are some research findings that give people a bit of like cause for concern. So like my recommendation is just do whatever the fuck your doctor tells you to do. I'm absolutely not going to go against that. And like, yeah, it is like, there is a reason that they recommend folic acid supplements, and folic acid, food fortification is a pretty common thing. And that is because like, that is very effective at preventing, a lot of types of neural tube defects. Like there are causes other than folate deficiencies that can cause neural tube defects, but like a lot of them are like related to folate deficiencies. And yeah, like they work really, really well for that. And I think the scientific consensus is that, like for most people, most of the time, the benefits outweigh the risks. And if you want to deal with it more than that on an individual level, again, that's, I think, a conversation to have with your doctor. Okay. Last question from Charles Bowes.
2 questions about micronutrients. First is about taking vitamin K with vitamin D. I was wondering what the evidence is behind taking vitamin K along with vitamin D, specifically on the impact on cardiovascular disease risk, because I've seen this recommended many times. The other questions about boron. I've seen boron supplementation kind of feel like increasingly recommended. I was wondering what the evidence actually says about supplementing with boron.
All right, Charles, thank you for those questions. So, starting with the first one, supplementing vitamin K along with vitamin D. I think that that's something that we'll know more about in a couple years. So there is some promising epidemiological evidence related to vitamin K status and vitamin K intake, related to like heart disease outcomes. So like people who eat more vitamin K and people who have like better like serum vitamin K status tend to have lower rates of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular disease mortality. But much like we've covered, I feel like multiple times just in this episode, correlation is not always causation. And in this case, like it could be that supplementing with vitamin K does cause positive cardiovascular health outcomes, or it could just be a mere association that's showing up in the research to this point. There are, I believe, like high quality RCTs underway. Most of the randomized control trials that exist to this point on vitamin K supplementation are like relatively short and have relatively small samples and are relatively inconclusive. The idea behind vitamin K supplementation is that, so vitamin K is a cofactor for a protein called, that's often just referred to as MGP or matrix GLA protein, which helps like prevent arterial calcification. And so like vitamin D helps with calcium absorption. And like D and K are both like implicated in calcium metabolism generally. And so like there are some people that recommend them to be taken together, like to kind of help like prevent arterial calcification, like due to the effects on the MGP. And yeah, like the mechanism makes sense. The epidemiological research is promising. But yeah, like at this point, before one, like I personally wouldn't be making this recommendation in the first place because we're talking about like a recommendation for like a specific disease outcome. Like that's for doctors to make. But in terms of like something I would feel confident making a statement about, if not a recommendation, like at this point, I want to see RCTs because like correlations don't always pan out to like causal effects on like disease risk or various outcomes in practice. And yeah, like as I understand it, research is currently underway that will give more clarity on that topic. But yeah, we're just kind of waiting for it to be published. So yeah, it's promising, but not conclusive. That's kind of what I would say about vitamin K. For boron, I both thank you for asking this question and also resent you for asking this question, because I've known that excitement about boron has been kind of floating around for a while, but I don't know why. For some reason, it's just not something I wanted to look into. I think it's because like a lot of the people promoting boron are folks who generally annoy me. Because like it's been just based on like my kind of fitness media consumption diet. Stuff related to boron has been inescapable, and like most of the more promising stuff I think relates to like bone health and like osteoarthritis. But the people that talk about boron the most tend to be like folks who kind of straddle the line between fitness influencers and masculinity influencers. Yikes. Because there are like a couple of small studies suggesting that like boron supplementation may increase testosterone levels a little bit. Yeah. And so like, yeah, if any like non-pharmaceutical increases testosterone, like the most annoying people on the internet are never going to shut the fuck up about it. And I think that that's the reason that I haven't wanted to look into it more. So anyway, thanks for the question, because it forced me to look into it a little bit more. And so, yeah, to kind of provide a good resource to check out, there is a 2015 paper that I suspect is where a lot of the optimism about boron came from. And it's like one of the things that got people talking about it more. Cause like, I don't remember people talking about boron in like 2013, which is like a time when I was dumber and I would have been far more interested in people saying like, ooh, this thing increases testosterone. Cause like, I used to think that was like way more important than it actually is. But yeah, like I don't remember people talking about boron in like 2012, 2013. Like it does seem to be like a post 2015 thing. And this paper has been cited like over 300 times. So it's been pretty influential. Like, and so I suspect this is where a lot of the chatter about it originated and where a lot of the optimism came from. And this paper, one, like has a good title. Like it has a catchy title for a scientific paper. It's Nothing Boring About Boron. And the author is Pizzorno. The main degree listed behind his name is MDiv, Master of Divinity, which I think is definitely the credential you would want for studying boron. But anyway, like I'm not trying to talk shit. Like I just have so much like resistance built up around this, right? Because the people who talk about boron annoy me so much. But yeah, so like it's a decent paper. It's I would say less of an objective evaluation of all of the evidence and more kind of like a cheerleading paper where which is totally fair, totally fine. It's just something to be aware of going into it, where it's someone who's like specifically trying to make the affirmative case that boron is good for a bunch of these outcomes and that people should supplement with boron. So it covers all of the evidence like in favor of it, but you know, isn't going to spend a lot of time discussing like some of the weaknesses or like drawbacks in the current body of evidence. So like if you're like me and kind of a boron skeptic, or if you're just uninformed about this and you want to know like why people are excited about it, I think this is not a bad place to start. In general, there are studies finding like outcomes that seem pretty promising. So like I said, I think most of this stuff that is the closest to being solid is looking at like effects on bone health or like function and pain in people with osteoarthritis. Although there's also some stuff looking at like boron supplementation reducing inflammatory biomarkers. And begrudgingly, there is some research suggesting that boron supplementation may increase testosterone levels, although that research is a little bit nuanced because it also suggests that like there might be potential boron toxicity reducing testosterone levels. So like in one study, they use like in general, I think what would be considered a relatively low dose of like 2 or 3 grams a day, and an even lower dose of like 500 milligrams. And at like a week or 2 weeks, there was a larger increase in testosterone in the group taking like 2 or 3 grams a day. But like 6 weeks later, that group actually experienced a small decrease in testosterone. But the group taking 500 milligrams was still like, it appeared that they were experiencing a continued increase in testosterone, which suggests that like boron might bioaccumulate in the testes. And if you consume too much and you're interested in the testosterone outcomes, like maybe it's going to do more harm than good. Anyway, not something I would take for testosterone because it seems like there's some unresolved questions, and I don't know, kind of skeptical about that one. But yeah, like basically there is, I would say, some calls for optimism, but I would also temper excessive optimism on this topic with a couple things. One is that most of the research has just looked at outcomes and there's not that much mechanistic stuff. So like there are some like positive findings related to like osteoarthritis, like pain and function, but like I can't tell you why those findings were observed. And like you don't need to know a mechanism for like an effect to be real, but for me to evaluate how plausible I find these findings, a mechanism sure would be fucking helpful. Because, and this is like the other kind of thing I would say to temper some of the optimism around this, most of the research finding positive effects from boron supplementation tend to be relatively small studies, and tend to be relatively short term, and tend to be studies that would be pretty cheap to run. And that's like the perfect set of circumstances for just like the wonders of publication bias to do its thing, and just wind up with a bunch of null findings that are just in a file drawer somewhere, with the handful of positive findings getting published, and therefore like a pretty unrealistic and like unrepresentative view of the research. So like, I don't know. I don't know how seriously to take this stuff. I do strongly suspect that if boron supplementation does have some of the positive effects that have been observed, the magnitude of the effect is probably considerably smaller than the current body of evidence would suggest it is, because again, like it is currently the perfect body of evidence for there to just be false positives, file drawer effect, like null findings not getting published, therefore like leading to an inflated perception of like what the effect magnitudes are. And like until some like more solid mechanisms are identified, like I retain like a healthy level of skepticism that it works if I don't have like a good, like at least a reasonable understanding of how it could work. So yeah, I don't know, like that's about where I'm at. But kind of the thing I want to end on is that 2015 paper, which, like I said, is kind of like a cheerleading paper for boron supplementation. It recommends supplementing with 3 grams of boron per day, but it also says, quote, "A diverse plant food rich diet is estimated to provide approximately 1.5 to 3 milligrams per day of boron. Foods of plant origins, especially fruits, leafy vegetables, nuts, and legumes, are rich in boron, as are plant-derived fermented beverages, i.e. wine, cider, and beer. Meat, fish, and dairy products, however, are poor sources. Peanuts and peanut butter, other nuts, raisins, wine, and avocado are also top contributors to boron intake. Although coffee and milk are low in boron, they provide 12% of total boron intake in the United States due to the volume consumed and the fact that the standard American diet contains so few servings of fruits, vegetables, and legumes. So, like, going back to where we ended this episode on, like, if boron does a lot of this good stuff, I kind of think, like, just try to eat some fruits and veggies, like a generally healthy diet. Due to the fact that, like, it might bioaccumulate in tissues, like particularly the testes, and there's so many unresolved questions. Like, I think that supplementing with it would be relatively unwise, especially at like reasonably high doses. Cause like, yeah, like, I just feel like we're playing with fire and there's like too many unresolved questions, but, there are no downsides and plenty of upsides to eating plenty of fruits and vegetables. So if you're interested in boron for bone health, for modulating inflammation, for possible effects on osteoarthritis, for possible effects on testosterone, for any of it, that's cool. Like, I don't want to like completely trample on your optimism, but the recommendation I would give for boron consumption is to skip the supplementation, just eat fruits and veggies. Because then even if none of the shit related to boron pans out, there are other benefits to eating fruits and veggies, and you'll still come out ahead. Whereas if you just took a boron supplement, you wouldn't, if this stuff doesn't pan out. So yeah, that's all we have for this episode. That is it for the questions.
Yeah. Fat Bear Week is underway, just to confirm.
Oh, hell yeah. Give us some updates.
So they have the left side of the bracket all filled out. On the left side of the bracket, 901, my current favorite. She's a mama bear. Very cute, very traditional bear shape. Very impressive transformation. 480 Otis this year, not as impressive. Looks like he didn't get as much food. 128 Grazer, though, an absolute unit once again.
Ooh, hell yeah.
Looking absolutely insane.
I might be jumping back on the Grazer train.
151 Walker is the one they're introducing right now. He looks great. He's so big. He's just sitting in the water.
Hell yeah.
Licking his chops. It looks like it's going to be a great year.
I am so excited. Okay, listener, thanks for listening. We're going to wrap up this episode really quick because I want to...
We got to watch this live stream.
Yeah, I got to hop on the Fat Bear Week live stream. Like, this isn't a bit. I am extremely excited about this. So thanks for listening. We love and appreciate you. We'll be back in a couple weeks. If you have questions for the podcast, again, next week is going to be an all Q&A episode. So if there's anything you'd like us to cover, record a voice clip, email it to podcast@strongerbyscience.com. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.